The forest had a name in the old tongue, though no orc alive still spoke it cleanly. They called it the Gnawing Dark now, and that was enough. Sura had been running for 3 days. She knew because she had torn 3 strips from the hem of her wrapping cloth, one each dawn, and knotted them to her belt so she would not lose count when the fever started talking to her. The fever was talking now. It told her that the roots underfoot were fingers. It told her that the canopy above was a jaw. It told her that the sound behind her, the wet, rhythmic crunch that rose and fell like breathing, was nothing, just wind, just the forest settling into cold. She did not believe the fever. She had been a scout for the Dusk-Talon war host long enough to know what giant things sounded like when they moved. Her left side had stopped hurting on the 2nd day. That was worse than the pain. The wound was deep, a tusk rip from one of the gnaw beasts when it had shouldered through the tree line and caught her mid-stride, spinning her off the ridge. She had tumbled 30 feet into a ravine and lain there with black dirt in her mouth and the sound of it above her, sniffing. She had not breathed. She had not moved her eyes. She had watched through the thin crack of her lashes as the thing's muzzle, the size of a millstone encrusted with dried blood, swept back and forth across the ravine's lip. Then it had gone, and she had climbed out, and she had run. Now the running was more of a listing walk. Her left arm she held pressed flat against her ribs because when she let it hang it swung wrong, and swinging wrong meant the wound opened, and she had nothing left to pack it with. The 3 strips of cloth from her hem were already soaked through and knotted tight over the tear in her side. She could feel the warmth spreading beneath them, warmth that had no business spreading. She stopped at a stream she almost missed because the fever had turned the sound of it into voices. Knelt, pressed both hands into the current and held them there until the cold climbed her wrists and she was thinking clearly enough to be afraid again. Afraid was useful. Fear had a shape and a direction. You could run ahead of fear. She drank, splashed her face. Looked up. The tree at the stream's edge was old enough that 3 warriors standing hand to hand could not have circled it. Its bark was the color of charcoal. Something had carved a groove into its roots, a groove the width of a war cart's wheel, pressed deep into the soil as if whatever made it weighed more than buildings. The groove led north, toward the high canopy, away from the sounds behind her. Sura looked at the groove for a long time. She had been told, the way all Dusk-Talon scouts were told quietly in the space between the last briefing and sleep, that there was something in the northern forest, something old. The war chief Vorek had called it irrelevant. The shamans had called it a ghost story. The shamans, Sura reflected, were also the ones who had made the god food. She followed the groove north. The god food had begun with the best of intentions. That was the part that sat like a stone in Sura's gut when she thought about it clearly. Warhost Dusk-Talon had been bleeding for years, raids from the eastern clans, poor harvests, the slow grind of children who didn't grow straight or grow strong. The shamans had been working the problem the only way shamans knew how, by pushing at the edges of what was possible. Sura had been 16 the first time she heard Varath speak. The senior shaman had been a tall woman even by orc standards, with beads in her crest braids that clinked when she walked, and a way of explaining complex things simply that the young scouts had called a gift and the older warriors had called dangerous. You didn't want the complicated things explained simply. You wanted to feel the weight of them. Varath made difficulty feel approachable, and the problem with approachable difficulties was that people approached them. They had found something in the deep-root chemistry of the ancient forest. A compound, Varath had called it, breathless with the discovery, holding up a vial of amber liquid that caught the light like a trapped sunrise. Something that tells the body to become more than it was. It had worked on the grain plants first. Tomato fruits the size of helmets, sprawling across the shaman tents like red landslides. The war host had cheered. Varath had wept with satisfaction. Then something had gotten into the pens. The gnaw beasts were the war host's supply animals, a species the size of large dogs, burrowing rodents with copper-colored fur and teeth designed for cracking root wood. They were useful, manageable, entirely unimpressive. They were also clever in the way that small, hungry things are clever. Two of them had gnawed through a storage crate and eaten a season's worth of the god food, and nobody had noticed until morning, when the pen fence was a wreck of splintered posts, and the two animals were the size of oxen and screaming. They had killed 4 warriors before the war host put them down. Varath had said, "This is a setback, we adjust the formula." Vorik had said, "We contain this. We speak of it to no one outside the war host." 1 moon later there had been 12 gnaw beasts the size of cottages loose in the forest, because the war host's stockpile had been stored poorly, and the rain had gotten in, and the runoff had reached the wild population. That was 2 moons ago. Sura had been on a scouting circuit for the first moon of it and come back to a war host half depleted, and a shaman who wouldn't meet anyone's eyes. She had volunteered to scout the northern perimeter, partly because someone had to, partly to be moving instead of standing still while Vorik's denial ate the camp alive. She had found the gnaw beast on her 4th night out, or the gnaw beast had found her. She had been making camp in a root-hollow, small fire, cold food, nothing that would attract anything by smell, when the trees around her simply stopped making sound. No insects, no night birds, not even the wind. 15 years of scouting, and she was moving before she thought about it, rolling left out of the hollow just as something the size of a granary crashed into the space where she had been sitting. The fire scattered. The cold food scattered. Sura ran, and the thing came after her, and it was fast, much faster than anything had the right to be at that size, and she had made it maybe 200 yards before the second one came in from the right flank, and the first tusk swing clipped her as she twisted. She went off the ridge. She landed in the ravine. She lay there with black dirt in her mouth and did not move. When it finally left, she climbed out and ran north, because north was the only direction she hadn't been from, and everything else was death. The groove in the earth ended at a place where the canopy opened into a rough circle, as if the trees had stepped back. The light came down pale and silver, the way it did in the last hour before full dark. In the center of the clearing was a structure, not built, grown. The roots of 7 massive trees had risen from the ground and twisted together into something like walls, something like a hollow, the entrance a low arch that smelled of cold stone and something older. Sura stood at the edge of the clearing and breathed. Behind her, roughly a quarter hour of walking, she had heard the crunch resume. She went inside. The hollow was large. Not large enough for what she saw, but large enough. In the far curve of the root wall in the deep shadow, something breathed. She heard it before she saw it, a slow exhalation, the kind that moved air the way a bellows moves air, rhythmic and vast. Then her eyes adjusted. She had expected another gnaw beast. What she was looking at was not that. It was low to the ground and long in the body, built like a predator but with too many angles, too much mass concentrated in the shoulders and the skull. Its hide was somewhere between fur and scale, a close-backed overlay of dark plates that caught the dying light and scattered it as faint copper. The head was wide and flat, like an old river stone, and the eyes, both of them tracking her from the moment she crossed the threshold, she realized. It had been watching her since she appeared in the clearing, were a deep amber, pupilless and still. It had been here a long time. The roots had grown around its habitual resting place, pressed down and smoothed by decades of the same weight. This was not an animal that had wandered. This was a thing that had chosen. It did not move. Sura was aware that she was listing sharply to the left. She was aware that the fever warmth in her side had become something more insistent. She was aware that her knees were doing something unreliable. "I'm not here to die," she said. Her voice was steadier than her body. She had always been grateful for that. "I just need to not be outside." The creature's head moved. Not toward her, it tilted slowly, the way a very old mind processes something unexpected. Its nostrils, she could see them now, A complex fold of cartilage along the lower jaw flared once. Then it exhaled again and put its head back down and closed the amber eyes to a slow, half-lidded watch. Sura sat down against the opposite root wall, pressed her right hand hard against her wounded side, and did not die. She woke to warmth on her left arm. Not the spreading warmth of infection, something external, dry, and deliberate. She opened her eyes in the gray pre-dawn light filtering through the root arch and found the creature's head approximately a foot from her shoulder, breathing slow and steady into the space beside her, not touching her. The heat was radiating off the plates of its hide like a banked fire. It smelled of river clay and pine resin and something sharper underneath, like metal that had been in the ground a long time. Sura stayed very still and ran through what she knew about large predators, which was more than most orcs because she had been a scout for 15 years, and curiosity was an occupational hazard. Large predators did not exhale heat at sleeping things they intended to eat. She looked at her side. The wound had been, she sat up slowly, bracing against the root wall. The wound had been packed, not with cloth, with something dark and fibrous, pressed into the tear in her skin with a precision that should have required fingers. The fiber smelled like the creature's hide. It had stopped the bleeding. She could tell because the spreading warmth was gone, replaced by a tight, pulling ache that meant the flesh was beginning to close. She looked at the creature. The creature looked back at her from its half-lidded amber watch. "You did that," Sura said. It blinked. The motion was slow and complete, both lids moving inward from the outer corners in the way of reptiles, not mammals. "I am going to be very calm about this," Sura said. "I am going to be calm because panicking would open the wound again, and I have already lost enough blood." The creature made a sound. Not a roar, not a hiss, something low and resonant, closer to the sound a large drum makes when you press your ear against it and someone strikes it softly on the opposite side. She felt it more than heard it. She did not panic. What she did instead was think. On the second day, she learned it had a routine. In the hours before dawn it left the hollow. She heard the soft displacement of vast weight moving through the entrance arch, and then the silence of its absence, which was its own kind of presence. It returned as the light strengthened, and what it brought back with it varied. Once a section of root bark stripped clean and woven into a rough mat that had dropped near her corner. She did not know what to make of this for most of a morning, and then she understood it was insulation, because the ground she had been sleeping on was cold. Once a flat stone from the stream bed, still damp, which she eventually worked out she was supposed to use as a platform for her fire kit because the root floor near her corner was dry enough to catch sparks. It did not speak. It did not gesture in any way she recognized as communicative, but the objects it brought were considered, and consideration was its own kind of language. She began to talk to it on the third day, because the silence and the fever had an uncomfortable tendency to blur together. "Your kind used to have a name," she said on the fourth day, sharpening a piece of root wood against the flat stone it had brought her. "The oldest stories call something like you the Ankareth, the Root Watchers. We used to ask your permission before we cut deep timber, supposedly. I think we stopped asking." She tested the point with her thumb. "I think we stopped asking a lot of things." The creature did not respond except with the drum sound, which she had begun to decode into rough categories. Low and brief meant acknowledgement. Lower and sustained meant attention. 2 strikes close together meant a warning she had learned to heed immediately, because the second time she had ignored it, a gnaw beast had appeared at the clearing's edge, and she had needed to be very fast and very flat. "They're going to destroy everything," she said. "The gnaw beasts. If Vorek won't order a retreat, if the shamans can't develop a reversal, they will eat through the forest and then through the war host and then through everything past it. You understand that, don't you? You've been watching this forest for long enough." The drum sound, low and sustained. "I thought so." She went back to sharpening. On the third day she stopped trying to leave. The first time she had tried to slip out at dawn, she had gotten 12 steps into the forest before the sound of crunching returned, much closer than it had been, and she had retreated to the hollow at a run that tore 3 days of healing back to 2. The creature had been waiting at the arch. It had looked at her wound with the same tilted head appraisal it used for everything about her, and then made the drum sound and walked back to its corner. She had stood in the hollow entrance with her heart pounding and made herself breathe slowly and thought, all right, something is different here. The second time she had tried to leave, she had gone south along a different route groove, one she found branching off the main approach, moving low and quiet the way 15 years of scouting had trained her. She had made it nearly to the tree line before the creature appeared at her left flank, not running, not aggressive, simply there, having come through the canopy above with a silence that made her question everything she thought she understood about things that large. It had stood in her path. She had said, I have a war host to get back to. It had not moved. They are going to keep dying if I don't bring them an answer. Its nostrils had done the complex fold thing. Then it had turned and begun walking back toward the hollow, and after a moment, because she had nothing better, she had followed. What she was learning slowly was this. The creature did not want her to die. It was not clear if this was a general preference or something specific to her, but the behavior was consistent. Food appeared, not hunted and offered, but redirected. The creature would return from wherever it went in the early mornings with small animals that it had clearly not bothered to finish, leaving them stunned or cornered in the hollow entrance for her to deal with. She dealt with them, she ate, she healed. On the 5th day she found the shaman. It had been Verath. She recognized the crest beads even though most of them had scattered. Verath, who had made the god food, who had held the vial up in the light and wept with satisfaction. The body was at the edge of the clearing, just inside the tree line. Sura found it by smell. She stood over it for a long time. Verath had not been killed by a gnaw beast. There were no tears, no tooth marks. What had killed Verath was what was inside Verath. The shaman's body distorted beyond sense, the flesh risen and ridged in patterns that looked less like wounds and more like something trying to grow outward through the skin from every direction at once. The god food. She had contaminated herself, or the reversal she had been working on had gone wrong, or both. The result was the same. Sura had known Verath. Not closely. Verath had not been close with anyone who wasn't also a shaman, but she had known her the way you know someone who has shaped the conditions of your life. The beads in the crest braids had clinked when Verath walked. The young scouts had loved her for making the complicated feel possible. Sura had been one of those young scouts once, and she looked at what remained of Verath and understood something about the distance between meaning well and doing well, and how enormous that distance could become. She pressed the back of her hand to her mouth, breathed slowly. Then she took the bead crest from what remained of Verath's collar, because it was the only record the war host had that Verath existed, and she put it in her belt pouch. When she turned around, the creature was behind her. It had come from the canopy again, that terrifying silence for something of its mass. It stood at the tree line, one of its forelimbs half raised as if it had been about to interpose itself between her and the sight. She looked at it. "Did you know her?" she asked. The drum sound, low and sustained, and then a third variant she hadn't heard before, a slow rise at the end, like a question that didn't know how to be a question. "She started this," Sura said. "She meant well, she wanted us to grow, to be more than we were." She looked at the body. She didn't ask what the forest thought about it. She didn't ask what was already living here, whether it had standing. She just took. We're good at taking. She closed her hand on the bead crest inside her pouch. "I'm sorry for that. I'm sorry we didn't ask." The creature stood with her for a long time, not moving, not eating, not hunting. Just standing. On the 7th day, she found the antidote. She had not been looking for it. She had been looking for a route back to the warhost that didn't cross the three-path corridors she had identified as Gnaw Beast territory, sketching the map on a piece of bark with a charred stick. The creature had been moving around the clearing doing whatever the creature did in the hours when it wasn't watching her, and she had looked up from the bark to track it and noticed what it was doing. It was eating, not hunting, grazing in a slow and purposeful way along the exposed sections of root at the clearing's edge. The roots it chose were specific, a thick arterial root of the largest tree, stripped of its outer bark by years of the creature's own passing, the white inner wood exposed and weeping a slow trickle of pale sap. She recognized the smell. She had smelled it in Varath's tent, in the early days before everything had gone wrong. She had smelled it in the god food before she knew what the god food was. She went to the root, crouched beside it, put a careful finger to the sap, and brought it to her nose. The same compound, or something close, something that had grown into its own stable state over however many centuries this forest had been feeding one ancient creature. The god food in its raw, unprocessed form had been extracted from root chemistry and concentrated until it was volatile, unstable, too much pressure in too small a space. What this was, what the creature had been consuming for decades, perhaps centuries, was the diffuse original. The long, slow version that told the body to become more than it was in a voice that didn't shout. And the creature was enormous and old and wholly intact, with no tumors, no rage, no bloating. Because it had learned the dose, because it had found the balance, because it had been living alongside this chemistry for long enough that its body knew how to manage what Varath had tried to compress into a single vial and inject into everything at once. Sura sat on her heels and stared at the root for a long time. She thought about Varath in the early days, running her experiments on the grain plants in the shaman tents, staying up long past the fire pit's last ember, driven by the specific and merciless energy of someone who has found the thing they were born to solve. She thought about the cheering warhost and the red landslide of tomato fruits. She thought about two small copper-furred animals gnawing through a storage crate in the night, curious and hungry, and entirely without malice. She thought about an ancient creature that had been grazing on the same root for perhaps 500 years and building, incrementally, through pure continuance of life, a working model of everything the shamans had been trying to synthesize in 3 moons. "You're not a ghost story," she said. "You're a working model." The creature had stopped grazing. It was watching her with the amber eyes. "I need samples," she said. "I need the raw sap, and I need to understand the mechanism, how the body handles this, how the modulation works. If I can bring back a sample and a record of what you are, not what we made, but what the original looks like, maybe the shamans who are still alive can work backward to a reversal." She spread her hands. "I'm a scout. I don't know if that's possible, but I know what happens if we don't try." The drum sound, low and brief, acknowledgement. Then the creature walked to the root and stood beside it, patient and vast, in the particular stillness of something very old that has decided to allow something. She gathered the sap into a hollow piece of bark she sealed with clay. She sketched the root structure, the specific section that yielded the compound, the way the creature's passage over years had stripped the bark and opened the wood to the air. She wrote what she could in the scout's shorthand she had used for 15 years, trying to put into marks on bark the idea of a living thing that had been in balance with a volatile chemistry for longer than the warhost had existed. She looked up once and found the creature watching her right. Its head was tilted at the familiar angle of processing. She had a brief, vertiginous sense that it understood what the marks were for, not the specific language, but the act of recording, of making a thing persist beyond the moment of its knowing. She looked back at the bark and kept writing. She did not know if it would be enough. She was going to try anyway. The route she planned went east before it went south, a long arc that she believed would take her around the worst of the Gnaw Beast corridors. The creature walked with her to the edge of the hollow's root territory, which was farther than she had expected, nearly a quarter-mile radius in which nothing challenged them, because nothing with instincts intact would get close to something that old and that large. At the territorial edge, it stopped. She stopped too, turned to look at it. In the 7 days, she had learned to read some things about its face, the way you learn to read anything if you paid attention long enough. The flat, wide skull had a range of expression she had initially thought was absent. It was just expression at a different scale, in the slow movement of the plate hide along the brow ridge, in the set of the jaw, in whether the amber eyes were fully open or half-lidded. They were fully open now. "I'll come back," she said. She was not certain it was a promise she could keep. She made it anyway. "If there's anything left, I'll come back. And I'll tell them, the ones who will listen, I'll tell them what you are, what this place is, what we nearly broke." The creature lowered its head. Not bowing, it wasn't made for bowing, didn't have that kind of deference in its architecture. But a lowering, a slow drop of the skull toward the earth, the amber eyes rolling upward to keep her in sight, as if it wanted to reduce its own height relative to her. As if size were a thing it had been carrying for a long time and occasionally wished to set down. She felt something happen in her throat that she did not have time for. "Right," she said, "right then." She walked east. The gnaw beasts hit her at the 3rd Stream crossing. There were 2 of them, not the 3 or 4 she had mapped as a corridor, which meant either her map was wrong or the corridor had shifted. She had half a second of that particular scout's calculation, exit routes, threat vectors, whether she could make the opposite bank before the closer one moved, and it was very fast for something the size of a war building. She ran. She was not yet fully healed and running hurt in a specific way, but hurt was information, and she used it the way she used all information. She knew exactly how much she could push before the wound reopened, so she pushed exactly that much and not more. She cleared the stream. She hit the opposite bank running and veered northeast, which was not her planned route, but was the only route that had a canopy low enough that the gnaw beasts would have to slow. The sound behind her was enormous, 2 of them, and they were not slowing. She heard the trees around her change pitch. Not the crashing of the gnaw beasts. Something else. Something that moved through the upper canopy at a speed that shouldn't have been possible for something that large. She felt it before she saw it. The way you feel a weather front before the rain comes. A pressure change. A shift in the air. And then the canopy above the lead gnaw beast simply descended. Not fell. Descended, controlled and targeted like a decision made at altitude. The creature hit the first gnaw beast with the full weight of something that had been alive since before the war host had a name, and the impact rewrote the landscape in a single concussive second. Sura felt the shockwave in her feet and kept running, because the second gnaw beast was still moving and the creature was occupied. She made the hollow between 2 root formations and pressed herself flat and looked back. The second gnaw beast had stopped. It stood at a distance of perhaps 40 yards, its enormous head low, its copper fur raised in a ridge along its spine. It was doing what prey animals did when they encountered something beyond the scale of their threat model. It was reevaluating. She watched it take 3 slow steps forward, sniffing. She watched it reach the edge of where the first gnaw beast had been and encounter. She could see the moment it processed the information. Not the first gnaw beast anymore, and the thing that had done this, still there, still present, swinging its flat, wide head toward the second animal. The second gnaw beast made a sound she had not heard from one of them before, high and thin and very brief. Then it turned and went back the way it had come. The creature stood in the ruined corridor for a long moment, then walked to where Sura was pressed against the root formation. It lowered its head and found her with the amber eyes. She was shaking. She was aware she was shaking and chose not to address it yet. "You followed me," she said. Low and brief, acknowledgement. "Why?" The drum sound. Low and sustained, then the question variant she had only heard once before, at Verath's body. She thought about that, then she said, because I came back to ask." It blinked, both lids inward from the outer corners. She reached the Warhost camp on the evening of the 9th day. What she found was smaller than she had left it. The camp had contracted, pulled tight around the central fire pit, the outer tents abandoned. There were sentries. She saw them before they saw her, which was professional habit and also concerning because the sentries were clearly exhausted and their sight lines were poor. She identified herself at 40 yards, standing in the open with both hands visible, because the camp was the kind of scared that shot first and counted later. They brought her to Vorek. Vorek was a large orc, gray-tusked and weathered, who had led the Dusk-Talon Warhost for 20 years on the strength of a tactical mind that could hold 6 variables at once, and a stubbornness that the stories called iron-willed and the people who worked with it daily called occasionally catastrophic. Sura had served under Vorek for 11 of those 20 years. She respected Vorek. She also knew exactly when Vorek was refusing to see something. Vorek was refusing to see quite a lot right now. "You were gone 9 days, Vorek said. "I had written you off." "Warchief." She put the sealed bark tube of sap on the table between them. She put the sketch record beside it. She put the bead crest from Varath's remains in front of both. "Varath is dead. Self-contamination with the serum, I believe, a reversal attempt that went wrong. The body is in the northern forest, approximately 2 miles east of the large cedar cluster." Vorek looked at the bead crest for a long moment. "I see." "I also found the original," Sura said. "The source compound in its natural state, stable, long-term, and a living example of an organism that has been managing the chemistry for what I estimate to be several hundred years without destabilization." "In the northern forest?" "Yes. The stories are accurate," Sura said. "The Ankareth is real. It is also the reason we have a chance at developing a reversal, because we now have a working model of what balance looks like." She tapped the sketch record. "I've documented everything I could. The shaman team will need to work quickly. The Gnaw beasts are extending their range. I counted evidence of at least 4 separate corridors in the 7 miles between the hollow and this camp, and 2 of them had active tracks no more than a day old." Vorek was quiet for a moment. Outside the tent, Sura could hear the camp's subdued movement, the particular quiet of people who had been afraid for too long. Somewhere beyond the perimeter, a night bird called once and then went silent, as if it had thought better of it. "The creature," Vorek said, "it's genuinely, it allowed you close to it." "It packed my wound with something from its own hide chemistry," Sura said. "It gave up hunting grounds to escort me to the edge of its territory. It killed a Gnaw beast in active attack to keep me operational." She paused. "And when I asked it to stand beside the root source so I could document it, it did." Vorek looked at her. "You asked it." "I asked it. And it's been here longer than we have," Sura said. "I think it's been waiting for us to ask." Vorek sat with that for a while. The fire in the tent's brazier was low, its light red and cautious, the kind of fire that didn't want to draw attention. Vorek looked at the bead crest, then at the bark tube, then at the sketch records with their 15-year perfected shorthand of a thing that shouldn't have been real and was. "The Dean," Vorek said. It was what the Warhost called Vorek's senior advisor, an older warrior named Torin who had been with the Warhost since before Vorek's time, and whose main qualification seemed to be an inexhaustible capacity for finding reasons not to act. "Torin won't like it. He's been arguing to move the camp east, right off this section of the forest entirely." "How many Gnaw beasts do they have east?" Sura asked. Vorek said nothing, which was an answer. "There isn't an east anymore," Sura said quietly. "There's here and there's the work and there's what we do next." She met Vorek's eyes. "The Ankareth didn't ask me what I was going to do with the sample before it let me take one. It didn't make me prove I deserved the chance. It just trusted that asking was the right thing. That coming back to ask meant something." She pressed her palm flat on the table, We owe it to mean something. Vorik nodded slowly. We do this at dawn. The shamans worked for 3 days. Sura slept for most of the first. When she woke, she went to the shaman tent and answered questions and watched the surviving practitioners. 2 of them, the young one called Peth and the older one called Yurik, who had been with the war host since before Sura was born, work through the sample and the documentation with the focused urgency of people who knew they were racing something. She told them about Verath. She told them everything she had observed at the root site, the sap smell, the way the creature had been grazing, the section of bark, and what it meant about slow exposure versus concentrated dose. She told them about the creature's condition, how it moved, its apparent age, the fact that its body had found a stable state that the shaman's extraction process had burned past. Peth, who was young enough to still be capable of being awed by things in the middle of a crisis, looked up from the samples and said, "It's not a compound, it's a process. It doesn't tell the body to grow, it tells the body to regulate. We extracted the signal and removed the feedback. That's what created the instability." "Yes," Sura said. "That's what I thought." "You're a scout." "I pay attention," Sura said. "It's the job." Yurik, who had not said much and had been doing most of the actual work, looked up from the mortar she had been grinding for 2 hours and said, "The child, Bobby, he's still out there." "I know," Sura said. "He took the serum in good faith," Yurik said. "He didn't steal it. Verath gave it to him to help him grow." "I know," Sura said again, and felt the weight of it. Bobby had been a child of the war host's dependent camp, not a warrior, not a scout, just a boy of 9 or 10 summers who had not grown at the rate the war host's healers said was healthy. His mother had gone to Verath asking for help, and Verath had given what help she had. The serum had been experimental, not ready, but Bobby's mother had been frightened, and Verath had been proud, and neither of them had known what was in the vial except possibility. Bobby was out there now, as large as a small house and as frightened as a child, because a grown orc had decided to help without asking whether the thing she was offering was safe. On the morning of the 4th day, Peth had something that might work. The lure was Sura's idea. She had been thinking about it since the 5th day in the hollow, since she had found Verath's body and smelled the god food on the wind and understood something about what she was carrying. The sap sample was the raw compound. The gnaw beasts had been built from the god food, which was derived from the same chemistry. And one of the things that had drawn the first pair of gnaw beasts to the shaman's stockpile was smell. The smell of a concentration of something their bodies recognized as home, as food, as correct. She had the concentration now, in a sealed bark tube, and she had a wound that, despite 7 days of the creature's care and 3 days of rest, was still weeping slightly at the edges when she pushed it, which meant she was carrying the scent of it on her person in a diffuse, unthreatening amount. She had been walking toward the gnaw beasts for 7 days and they had found her twice. She had been drawing them. "If I open the tube at the camp's northern perimeter," she said to Vorik and the surviving warriors, "and I walk a line southeast toward the rocky ground past the creek, where the terrain is open and the sightlines are good, the gnaw beasts will follow the scent. They will come toward it. And if your archers and Weisel's spear line are positioned at the creek before I start walking—" "You are the bait," said Vorik. "I have been the bait since day 4, Sura said. "I'm proposing we do it on purpose this time." Vorik looked at her for a long time. Sura had been looked at this way by Vorik before. It was the look Vorik used when working through the variables and finding an answer that was correct and unpleasant. "And the reversal," Vorik said. "Peth's compound." "They'll need to hit them after the kill," Peth said, from the doorway of the shaman tent. "The compound needs to be introduced into the body. I can put it in the arrowheads if the arrowheads have a hollow channel. We treat the ones that aren't dead. We push the system back toward regulation. It's not guaranteed, but the ones that don't die might become manageable." "And Bobby," Vorik said quietly. because there was still the giant child to consider. Bobby is a different problem, Sura said. Bobby gets the reversal first if we can reach him before anything else. She looked at Vorik. He didn't choose this. Someone chose it for him. Vorik nodded slowly. We do this at dawn. The dawn was gray and cold, and Sura stood at the northern perimeter with the bark tube in her hand, and the creek 300 yards behind her, and the tree line 15 yards ahead. She thought about the creature standing beside the root with its amber eyes fully open. She thought about the drum sound that meant acknowledgement, which was also the sound of one very old thing deciding, after a long time of waiting, to trust. She opened the tube. The smell hit the air like a struck bell. Concentrated, saturated, a wave of the compound that swept outward through the cold air at the tree line and beyond. She breathed it in deliberately. If she was going to do this, she was going to do it fully, and felt it in the back of her throat. She started walking southeast. She counted her steps. 15 years of scouting meant she knew her pace to a fraction, knew how many steps from the northern perimeter to the creek, could calculate the margin without looking. The tube in her right hand she tipped sideways as she walked, letting the sap trail across the dead leaves and soil in a clear line behind her. She heard the forest change. It was the same change she had heard on the third stream crossing. The sound of the gnaw-beast's passage, but different now, not the random hunting movement she had learned to dread. This was direct, purposeful. She had given them a direction. She did not look back. 150 paces. The creek was close. She could hear it. The killing ground ahead. The open rocky shelf where the terrain dropped and the sightlines opened up, and Weisel's line would have clear angles. 200 paces. The sound behind her was very loud now. 2, possibly 3 of them. The ground vibrated faintly against her feet and her body wanted to run. She felt it in the legs, in the spine, the screaming biological instruction of something chased by something larger, and she breathed, counted, held the pace. 240. She heard Weisel's signal whistle from the right, one short note. The line was ready. 260. The creek bank was 10 paces ahead. She stepped down to its edge and stopped, standing on the near bank with the water at her feet, and she turned around. The first gnaw-beast broke the tree line 30 yards back and slowed. It slowed because it had tracked the scent to its source and found the source standing still, looking at it, which was not what prey did. The gnaw-beast's threat model struggled with this. She could see it in the way the massive head swung, the nostrils working, the copper fur ridge rising. Here, Sura said, her voice was very steady. Right here, come on. The second one emerged to the left, the third to the right. She thought of a creature that had been in balance for 500 years, that had survived everything the forest could become, that had packed a stranger's wound with its own body, because something in its ancient architecture had decided that a thinking, asking thing was worth keeping alive. She thought of amber eyes rolling upward to keep her in sight, of something vast choosing, very deliberately, to be small. Now, she said quietly, now would be ideal. The arrowhead sang. It was not quick and it was not clean, but it was sufficient. 3 dead. 2, the ones Peth's arrows found deep in the hindquarters, stumbled and collapsed and lay breathing hard for an hour, and then, with the extraordinary slowness of a body remembering how to regulate, began to shrink. Sura watched from the creek bank, sitting because her legs had made the decision without consulting her. She watched the 2 remaining gnaw-beasts breathe and diminish and breathe and diminish, until they were the size of large dogs, and then the size of regular dogs, and then they lay curled and shivering and spent. And she felt something happen in her chest that she had been carrying since the ravine on day 1, something that had been locked tight against the injury and the fever and the running, and she let it go now because there was nothing left to run from. Peth sat beside her. It worked, Peth said a little wonderingly. Don't sound surprised, Sura said. You built it. I built it in 3 days with a field sample and your notes. And 15 years of someone paying attention, Sura said. The notes were good. Peth laughed. It was an exhausted, shaky laugh, but it was real. They found Bobby 2 days later in the deep eastern forest. He was large, not as large as the beasts had been at their worst, but far beyond any orc she had seen, and he was frightened in the way that things become when they have been frightened for a long time. Very quiet, very still, conserving energy for whatever came next. He had made a camp of sorts against a cliff face, a windbreak of branches, a small fire. The fire was the thing that found them before they found him. She had smelled the smoke and followed it for half a morning, and when she came out of the trees alone, no weapons visible, hands open, he had pressed himself back against the cliff and made a sound she recognized from her own worst nights in the hollow. I know, she said, I know it's all right. We have something that can help. I didn't ask for this, he said. His voice was enormous, lower than it should have been, weighted with days of not using it. No, she said, you didn't, and I'm sorry we let it get this far. She held up the last sealed tube Peth had prepared. This will take time. It won't be instant, but it will work and it won't hurt you, and you won't be out here alone anymore. Bobby looked at the tube, looked at her. His eyes, she noticed, were the same as they had always been, large and dark and still recognizably a child's, the rest of him having grown around them without consent. You're not scared of me, he said. I've had a complicated week, Sura said. He laughed. It rolled out of him like something that had been in storage too long, rusty and surprised and entirely real. She gave him the tube. She sat with him against the cliff face while he drank it slowly, the way you drink something when you're afraid to hope, in small, careful amounts, and she told him about the hollow and the root and the amber eyes and the drum sound that meant acknowledgement. He listened to every word. He asked when she was done, did it have a name? The old stories call its kind the Ankareth, she said, the root watchers. And it just let you stay there, it didn't have to. No, Sura said, it didn't have to. Bobby was quiet for a while, looking at the fire. I want to go back there, he said, someday, when this is done. I want to go see it. Sura nodded. When you're ready, she said, we'll go together. Sura went back to the hollow. She had said she would, and she did. 3 weeks later, when the camp was stable and the beast problem was managed if not solved. There were still a handful in the deep forest, and Peth was refining the compound, and Vorik had ordered all remaining stockpiles of the original serum destroyed and the records sealed. The forest was quiet in the way forests get quiet after a catastrophe, attentive, reconfiguring, testing what remained. She went alone, and she went without urgency, the way you return to a place that matters. The hollow was as she had left it. The root torch, the pale light from the open canopy, the grooves in the earth worn smooth by decades of the same weight. She sat where she had sat the first night, back against the root wall, hands in her lap. The creature came from the canopy. It settled into its corner and looked at her with the amber eyes, half-lidded and still, and exhaled once in the low, slow way that moved the air like a bellows. Sura reached into her belt pouch and took out Varath's bead crest. She had been carrying it for 3 weeks. She set it on the earth between them. She meant well, Sura said. I know that's not enough. But I wanted you to know that I know it. She pressed both hands flat against the root floor, feeling the wood, the deep vibration of whatever it was that was always moving through old trees at a frequency too low for ears. We're going to do better. I don't know how to make that mean anything yet, but I wanted to say it out loud, to something that was here before we started making those kinds of promises and breaking them. The drum sound came, low and brief. Acknowledgement. We have a boy, she said, Bobby. He wants to come see you when he's ready. He asked if you had a name. She looked at the creature. I told him you did. I told him the old stories call your kind the Ankareth, the root watchers. She paused. Though I think you've been watching longer than the stories know. The creature's head tilted at the familiar angle. One amber eye rolled toward the bead crest on the floor, then back to her. "I thought so," Sura said. She stayed for a long time. The light moved through the canopy overhead in its slow arc, and the hollow was warm with the creature's exhaled heat, and the bead crest sat between them on the root floor like an offering and like an admission. Outside, the forest made its usual sounds, and they were only sounds. When she finally stood to go, the creature raised its head and watched her with both eyes fully open, the amber clear and still and very old. And she had the feeling, the way you sometimes have a feeling about very large and very patient things, that it had been watching the forest for long enough to know that something had shifted. Not solved, not repaired, but shifted. The direction of it changed. She walked back to the Warhost camp under the trees of the gnawing dark, which was a name that had always been about fear, and she thought that someday, not soon, but someday, the forest might get a different name. The kind given to places where something went wrong and then something went right, imperfectly, at great cost, by people who had finally learned to ask. The roots ran deep in every direction, and the amber eyes followed her to the edge of the territory, and then she was alone in the forest walking south, carrying a sample of sap and a record of a creature that had been in balance for centuries and a shaman's bead crest, and 3 weeks of being alive when she shouldn't have been. And that, she thought, was probably enough to start with. She hummed quietly a tune her mother had sung when the season turned and the light came back, a small, old song about things that stayed when everything else moved on. She hummed it until the hollow was out of earshot, and then she walked the rest of the way home in silence, listening to the forest breathe.